Hey everyone, this is Jalen with Daily Code Tips. In this video, we are going to create two applications that one uses the Redux architecture and the other uses the context architecture. We're going to explore the differences between the Redux API and the context API, and you can decide which one is better for your project needs. All right, so we'll get started with creating basically we'll call an API. We will then present the results of that API back to the user. We can also introduce a progress bar into that, and we will do the same thing for the Redux architecture as well as for the context API architecture, and we will see which one we like better. All right, so let's get started. So we'll start off with the Redux architecture. So I have two folders here. I have one that is, they're both create React apps, and that's all they are. They have nothing more to it. They're just create React apps. That's it. One is named Redux API, the other is Context API. We'll start off in this folder, Redux API, and what's running here right now is the Redux API folder, right? So let's get started. We'll go ahead and delete some of these things that we don't need. Create React app gives you a few files that you may or may not actually need. So we'll go ahead and just delete some of these. This logo.svg, and we'll make sure to remove this, which we don't need. And we will get rid of this and that, as well as this. And then I'll just remove that comment there. And then if we go back to the page and we reload, all it says is application. That's it, right? Okay, and the API that we're going to be calling is this JSON placeholder API, which is just a list of users. That's all it is, right? So to get started, we'll go ahead and design our Redux architecture. So how are we going to have this? Now, basically, we're going to have a component, let's say a home component, and an API will be called on that component, and then basically just an action creator will be dispatched, and a Saga will catch that action and then call the API and then do a yield put on that, dispatch out another action to a reducer, which will then change some state and thus manipulating the React DOM tree. So what we'll do here is we'll have a components directory and we'll have a home directory, and we'll just have index.js in there. We'll say import React from React. We'll say function home and return a div, which will just say home. We'll export default home, and inside of app, we'll go ahead and import home in. And if we look at it, it should just say home on here, right? Now we're gonna need a few packages for this. So we'll go ahead and just say Redux API, we'll say yarn add. We'll need Redux, we'll need Redux Saga, we'll need Axios, we'll need, let's use Ant Design, and actually we'll just have Redux, Redux Saga, and Axios in there. You know what? I'll do Ant Design too. So we'll go ahead and add those, and we do that. So that's going to take a little bit to download. In the meantime, we're also going to need React Redux as well. So I'm going to add that whenever that's finished. So to get started, what we're going to need is we're going to go ahead and call use effect. So we're going to import use effect in, and whenever the home component is mounted, the use effect will be called, and it will then dispatch out an action, which will later be called by our Saga. So use effect is equivalent to a component did mount or a component did update, and it can also take dependencies and only get called whenever a certain dependency has changed. So in use effect, what we can do is we can say something like props.get users, right? Now get users hasn't been created yet, and that's something that we're going to need to create. So right now this would do absolutely nothing. And this use effect would actually run every time the component updates. So we want to add an empty array of dependencies, which is basically is equivalent to a component did mount. So we'll go ahead and just do that. Now for our action creator, we'll call it get users. So we'll go ahead inside of the home, we'll create a folder called Redux. and we'll create a folder called actions. We'll also create a folder called types, and that will go inside of Redux. This is kind of the architecture that I like to have. I like to have reducers, actions, types, and sagas inside of each component that needs Redux. So inside of actions, we would have the get users actions, right? .js. And this could be like get users or update users, etc., etc. So export const get users, and this is going to be our action here. And we'll have a type, right? So the type is going to be inside of the types folder, which actually I don't want to be a folder. I would let that actually be a file. So I'll just say types.js. And I'll go ahead and export default and just say something like get users, right? Get users. And that will be my types. And then inside of actions, I'll go ahead and import the types. So import types from types, and then I'll just say types.getUsers, just like that. And that's my action creator, right? So back in here, we want to import that action creator in, get users, and we would use something like connect from React Redux, which allows us to connect this component to our Redux store, which we haven't created yet. So get users will be the action. So basically this is going to map that action to the properties, and so that we can call props.getUsers, and that action creator can be dispatched out and then later on caught by our Saga. So right now nothing is listening in for types.getUsers. So we're going to create our Saga, and we'll just say something like get users saga.js. And what we'll do is we'll import take latest, and we'll import put. We'll also import call from Redux Saga /effects, and we'll say function watch get users, and we'll also have a function set get users, right? So in here, what we want to do is we want to take the latest. So this is going to listen in for that dispatched out action, and it will call this function here, right? So we'll say we want to listen for that type. So import types from types. We want to listen in for types.getUsers, and we want to call the getUsers function whenever that gets called. So let's export default watch getUsers so we can put that in our store later on. Then what we want to do is, what I like to do is I like to have a root saga, but we'll get to that in just a second. Let's go ahead and import Axios as well. So it's Axios from Axios. And set get users is going to be, basically here's what we have so far. So we have this action creator, type get users, right? When the use effect is, when this component is mounted, it will call this action creator, it will dispatch out the event. This saga will catch that action, get users, and then later on call this function, right? So if we console.log, I just got called from the component or whatever, right? This isn't going to work just yet. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a store, because right now React doesn't know anything about Redux right now. We need a store. So we'll go ahead and create our store.js. We will import create store. We also need to import apply middleware as well from Redux. And we also need to import create saga middleware from Redux Saga. We're also going to need to import our root reducer and our root saga, which we don't have a root reducer, we don't have a root saga yet. So let's go ahead and create our root reducer.js and our root saga root saga.js. Now this saga is going to be, we're going to need all and fork, I believe, from Redux saga-fx. And let's just say export default, let's say, well, hold on, let's say export const root saga, or export function root saga, and it's yield all, and it takes an array, I believe, fork, and then so yield all, and then we fork a bunch of different sagas. So that's how we're going to handle that. And we're going to go ahead and import our root saga in here from root saga. And we're going to do, for the root reducer, we're going to have basically, we want to combine the reducers. So it's just combine reducers from Redux. And we'll just do export const root reducer is equal to combine reducers, like so. And that's just, you're just going to combine the reducer. So I'm going to say like get users, and then it's going to have that reducer. But we don't have that reducer yet, so we can't really do anything yet. So we'll just say root reducer here from root reducer. And we're going to have to say const saga middleware is equal to create saga middleware. And in here, you can actually pass in an on error event, which will give you the error stack and the error as well whenever a saga has failed, but that's fine. We'll just go ahead and just create the saga middleware for now. And we also want to create the store. So let's say create store, and we'll have our root reducer in there, as well as apply middleware, which we can put in our saga middleware as well. Then later on, we'll go ahead and saga middleware.run, passing in our root saga, right? And then what we want to do is just export default the store, so we can use that later on, right? Okay, so now that we have that, we want to import the store into our main application. So we'll just say store and then store.js, right? We also want to import the provider. So we say import provider from React Redux, which we don't have yet. So let's go and say yarn add React Redux. So this, we import the provider and a store, just like that. And that will allow us to have access to Redux in our components. So we don't have anything for this root reducer, so we need to go ahead and add that. So I'm going to say get users reducer.js. And I like to use immutable JS for this, so I'll just say immutable yarn add immutable, or yarn add immutable. Right, so I'll say import map from JS from immutable, and I just say import map from immutable, and I'll say const initial state is equal to map, and I'll also say see, it should be downloaded. Yeah, yarn add immutable has been downloaded. That's good. Now, is it in there? Yeah, here we go. All right, so our initial state is just going to be users, which is going to be an empty array. And then we'll have const get users reducer is equal to, and I'll export default get users reducer. And what I want to do is I want to say something like, so the types that we're looking for, right? Get users, we also going to need a set users command, right? So this reducer will say if Now we'll say we have access to state and initial state, and we have an action. So we'll say if the action type is equal to, and we'll go ahead and import the types from types. If it's equal to, we'll have another one here for set users, right? Now, if it's equal to types.set users, then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and merge that new data into that initial state. So we'll say return state.merge, and we'll merge in a new set from action dot, let's call it new users. And that hasn't been specified yet, so we'll go ahead and just do that. And then otherwise we'll just return the state like so. So that should be good. And then what we'll go ahead and do is we'll go back to our index and kind of follow through with this. So let's see, we got everything going so far. We got our action creator. We're gonna call the action when the use effect goes. We have it here. The Saga will then catch that action, take the latest one, call this function, which is a console log. That's all that is. And then the reducer doesn't have access to it yet. So this Saga, all it's doing is console logging, right? Whenever that dispatch gets caught by that Saga. So what we want to do is we want to call an API. So we'll go ahead, I'll create another function here, call API, right? What we want to do is yield call API, and I'll say const results is equal to that. And inside of call API, what we want to do is we can say something like const data equals yield axios.get, and then we just pass in the URL here, right? Pass in the URL. Oops. There, right? And then we'll have access to the data. So then we can console log the data, or let's just return the response back. And I want to see the results. I'm not sure what the JSON structure looks like. So I can do something like return yield axios.get, so I can see what the results look like. And back to the store. So the root reducer, let's go ahead and pass in that new reducer we just created, the get users reducer here. All right, let's go ahead and pass that in from components, home, Redux, reducers, get users reducer. So we'll pass that in as our root reducer, and then in store, we have our root reducer here, which I'm exporting. So if you're gonna export it, then you need to put in something like that, root reducer like that. And so now that we have that, what we want to do is we have our provider, we have our home. I think right now we have pretty much everything set up in order for that Saga to get called and that API call to be in. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the logs here, and got a couple errors here, which is fine. It says fork is undefined. So let's go to the Saga. It says fork. Oh, of course, we haven't added our Saga in. So we'll just say, we'll get our users, so watch get user Saga. We need that. So we'll put that in here and go to our components, home, Redux, Sagas, get user Saga. And we'll pass that in. So we'll try this again, reload the page, and there we go. So we got some data back from the API, and it's just the users, right? So here's what happened. On the use effect, which is equivalent to a component did mount, it basically just dispatched out an action, which then the Saga was listening in for that action, then called this other generator function, which then called this call API function, and then called the API and returned back the results from that generator function from this yield statement. So right here, what we want to do with this, we want to dispatch another action out to our root or reducer that's associated with this. So we'll say yield put, and this takes in another action, which just dispatches out another action. So in our actions, we'll go ahead, let's copy this, and we'll say set users, right? And this will be types.set users, and we'll have this time new users in there, right? And we'll paste that in, right? And then inside of Sagas, what we'll do is we will import that set users action, and we'll pass that in, and then we will put in the results dot data in there, because that's what we get back from that API, and that will dispatch out the action to that, and I'll just return yield that, and then this reducer will catch that. So if we console.log this action here that we just set up, that reducer will catch it and the state will be changed. You see it right here, type set users, and it has access to the new users there. So this new users has been merged into this initial state. So now whoever connects to this part of Redux will have access to the users. So we go ahead, so let's go ahead and create another folder, like completely unaware of the home component, and we will have access to those users. So we'll say function users, and we'll return div export default users, right? And if we just import connect from React Redux, and we just connect it in, then what we can do is we can have const map state to props equals state, and we can return a piece of state, right? Now the state that we're looking for is from this reducer right here, users. And our root reducer has access to get users. So the way we're going to access this is we're going to say users is going to be state.getUsers.users, right? And then in here, we'll have access to users. So if we console.log users in this component, we will see it down here that we have the users from that API call. Oops, let's go back. And here we go, we got an object. Actually, that was from the that was from the reducer here. We haven't actually added this user's component into the application. So let's go ahead and add that into the application. Okay, and if we reload the page, we should see that it's undefined. So that's not correct here. This has been undefined. So the way we would debug this is let's console.log this state and see what the state is. Okay, so we're using immutable JS, right? So we can't just access it like this. We have to do get in order to get that data, just like that. So if we go back here and remove the state console.log, go back, we have this array here, right? And this just came from the component. Initially it was empty, called the API, and now it's not. So what we can do is we can say something like if users.length is equal to 0, then return div loading, right? We should see that it's loading, and then you saw that quickly loading, and then it's done, right? So let's remove that this really quickly. Let's go ahead and remove that, and let's actually put users in here, and let's remove it from here. Just keep it in home and put it there. That's what we'll do. And what we want to do now is we want to map through the users. So we'll just say we'll just go ahead and map through the users. Here we'll say render users, const render users, like so. And let's just pass in the users here. Users, we'll pass in the users. And if users, we'll say users return users.map user, and we will return a user. Okay. All right. So, and then here we'll have a file called user.js. We'll import React from React, and we'll function user return div export default user. And in here we'll have a property that we'll pass for that particular user that we're doing. So we'll say user and import that user in. So user, import that in, right? And now we have access to that user. So if we console.log this particular user out, we will see that we have all those users here. So all these, right? So let's just go ahead and print out the name, and we'll call it a day for this Redux example, right? And there we go. So basically, to wrap up that, we basically just went ahead, created a store, created our architecture to set up for future sagas and reducers and everything. We set up a way for us to call APIs and catch them by sagas. So going back, what we have, we basically just have this use effect, which is a componented mount, and calls an action creator. The saga catches that action and then dispatches, well, it dispatched out that action, the saga catched it, and then called this function, which then called this function, which then called set out an API call, gave the results back, then dispatched out another action back to set users, which this reducer was listening in on, and then merged the new state into users. And then we later on used that to render out the users by mapping through it, passing it in as props, and then rendering out the name. So that's the Redux architecture. This I find to be good for large scale applications. The context API is what we're going to do next. So let's go ahead and do that. So go ahead and go to context API, and let's yarn start that. Let's get out of this one and yarn start this one instead. So we yarn start that one. Give that a second. We're going to need some of the same packages that we used here. Since we've already covered some specific things here, we'll go ahead and just show you how the context API works, and we'll do this in a very bare bones fashion here. So I'll go ahead and add I guess just Axios, right? That's pretty much, I don't need Redux, I don't need Redux Saga, I need Axios, so let's go ahead and add that. And then it's going to start the development server. It's going to be an empty create React app application, which is fine. That's what we're going to do. So let's give that a second. Let's go into the context API one. We'll do the same thing we did for the previous one, and we'll go ahead and delete some of these files that we do not need. So let's remove those, and logo.svg, let's remove that. We're going to remove these and just say app and remove this and remove that, and then this comment here. Okay, now reload, and then we just have app. So this is the context version of that, right? So for the context version, what we want to do is pretty much kind of the same way of how we set up the components. So let's say we have our home and we have an index.js file. We import React from React, and we say function home return div export default home, and we'll pass in home here, right? Actually, this needs to be components home index. There we go. So we run this and we should just see home, right? Now the context API, here's how we're going to do it. we're gonna have a home context.js, right? We're gonna import, let's see, what will we import? Create context from not this, but from React. Let's say import React, create context from React. And we want to export const home context, and that's going to equal create context. And we want to also export const home provider, which is going to equal props, and we're just going to basically have some state on there. So let's just say use state, and we'll just say const state. We'll also have set state, and it's just gonna use some state. Let's just have a default state, which is gonna equal something, okay? And in that default state, I'll just have users, which is an empty array. So I'll go ahead and add that in. And then what we want to do is return a component, which is just going to be the home context dot provider, right? So that's what that's going to be. And then inside of that, we want to do props.children. So basically, this is just a high order component, which is just going to give any of the children access to this state, right? By passing in this value here, which is going to have state and set state. And we can use array destructuring here in order to get that. So we'll go ahead, and that's how we're going to set this up, right? And the next thing we're going to need to do is go to our application here, and we need to map this in a home provider. So home provider, we need to wrap this in a home provider. So let's do that. Let's wrap that in a home provider, just like that. And now home should have access to the state. So we'll say use context, and we'll say const state. We'll say const state and set state, which is some array destruction we're using. And we're going to grab that context we just created from home context here, and we're going to say home context, just like that. And we're going to pass that in here, just like that. So if we console.log the state, and let's just put, like, I don't know, hey in there, we should get back the context for that. Hey, right? So we basically just wrapped in the provider here. We wrapped this home component in a home provider, and the home provider is an HLC that basically just passed down state to this home. So it's the same thing with Redux, where we had the provider, and it's basically giving you state management ability to hook into any part of the state on any part of the application. So all we did was use context, and we had access to that state, which is all living inside of here, right? So let's remove that. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did where we used effect. We'll use effect, and this is going to be a component mount. And we will do, let's see, we'll call the API. So let's put on here, call API, which is just going to be a function, right? So let's go ahead and create a methods file, .js, and we'll just say function call API, like so. And let's go ahead and import Axios. From Axios, we'll say const data equals axios.get, and we'll get that URL that we used. We'll pass that in, and we will use, this will be async behavior, so we'll say await, and then we'll console.log the data back, right? That's all we'll do. And let's export this function out, and in the home, let's import it in. right? Call API equals call API. So it's just a function, that's all it is. And it's on this default state. So this is a method, kind of like the action creator in a sense, right? So back here, what we're gonna do is we're going to call state. So on here, we'll say state.call API, like so. And looking at it, call API, we'll just call this other function here. We should just call this function here, right? So if we go and look at it, let's see what happens. We get back the results, right? Perfect. So that called the API, gave us back the result. And then what we can do is we can set the state for the users here. So inside of call API, as a matter of fact, we don't really need this to be on the default state or anything like that. State is really used for just showing and changing from the React tree. You wouldn't have methods on there like that. This can just be a standalone function inside of there, and we can just import in call API just like that. And then we just call the API and we pass in set state inside of it, basically, right? So inside of here, we pass in set state, has access to that. And then what it's gonna do is data.data. So I'll say response.data. Response.data is equal to the users, right? So what we can do is we can say set state. And a good way of changing this state inside of home context, there's a certain way you need to do it. So what I'll do is I'll create a utilities folder, and I'll create a file called constants.js. Now export out a function called update state. Export const update state is equal to, what it's going to take in is set state and the new state, right? And basically, we're going to just return set state, and I'm going to just pass in, it's going to take in the previous state, and it's just going to return out the previous and the new state, like so. So that would be all we have to do for that to update the state. Previous state, call that previous state and then new state. That's all we need to do for that. So we'll go back to the home context, or we'll go back to the methods here, and we'll import update state here. And we want to update the state passing in set state and new state, which is users, and then res.data. Right? So just return out of that. And then let's go ahead and see if the state was updated, in fact. So let's just console log the state, reload the page, and there it is. Users was updated. At one point it was at 0, and then it was updated from this call here. And cool thing about the context API is, just like with Redux, we can create another folder here and standalone from that folder, index.js, import React from React function users, return div, and export default users. So we can use the home context, and we can take use context, and we can say const state set state equals use context from the home context. And then if we console.log the state, we have access to the state from the home context. Only if we decide to pass this inside of that user, that home component here. So by having users here, right? Users will have access to that state. So if I go ahead and just say from users and look at the state, we should see the same thing we saw. Boom, we got our users array. Now we can map through that like we did before, where we say render users, and we pass in, you know, let's say const render users, and we could just say if state dot users dot length is greater than 0, then return state dot users dot map user, and have a component user which just has user which equals to user, right? And then we just create our file user.js, we import React from React, and have our function user return div export default user, and then it has access to user, and then we could just print out user.name like so, and show user from user, and then that's all we really need. We don't need set state, and then we have user just like that. And then if we show this, we should just see the users back from there, right? So that's the difference between the context API and the Redux API. Let me know which one you like better. Personally, I find that the context API is a lot cleaner, I would say. Redux is a lot of different steps involved. I would say that for large-scale applications, Redux is probably a better fit, mainly the architecture and everything, being able to, you know, have different kind of action creators and types and all types of different protocols involved, versus the context API, which is a little bit more, I'd say it would be good for smaller applications. But looking at the differences, I like to combine them together, context API and the Redux architecture. They're both very good. So let me know what you think about these two different APIs here. This is Daily Code Tips. I'd like you guys to subscribe to my channel and like everything. So thank you very much, and I'm out.